This is discussion 17A. It's the only part of the discussion. I want to set up a little comparison here. And I'm not going to go too deep into the comparison, but I just want to mention Ming China and compare it to Europe at the end of the Middle Ages. Ming China was, when last we checked in, the Mongols had conquered virtually all of China, and they had set up the Yuan dynasty. And this was a really big, powerful dynasty for a long time. It included all the way up into Manchuria. It included southern China, and it was really wealthy and powerful. But I mentioned that the Mongols really saw China as something to be exploited in a lot of ways. They had kept the Mongol population separate from the Chinese population. They hadn't intermarried. They had prevented. They actually outlawed Chinese people from learning Mongol and the language. And they had encouraged trade quite a bit, but they had also really extracted all the wealth they possibly could from the Chinese population with really high taxes and really sort of draconian policies towards the Chinese population. And I mentioned that overall, over the course of the Mongol dynasty, the population of China fell from about 100 million down to about 70 million. Well, the Mongol dynasty was finally undone by an outbreak of plague. Now, this was not the plague in Europe and the Middle East was in 1348, but it's the same disease. There's an outbreak in Western China in 1368 that spreads throughout China, causing massive loss of life. And this essentially is the final straw that caused the Mongol dynasty in China to collapse. And the Mongols simply retreat to Mongolia. They're kicked out essentially, but they retreat to Mongolia, and in its place, China gets the Ming Dynasty, and the Ming Dynasty is founded in 1368. It would last until 1644, and the Ming Dynasty was founded by a Chinese general, a peasant actually, who had risen up through the military named Hong Wu. Who takes power in 1368, and he would actually rule for about 30 years. He was a really capable emperor, but he really saw his job as rebuilding China after the Mongol devastation. And so he did a whole bunch of things that really helped China to rebuild. The first is that he needed to stabilize China against the Mongols. So under the Ming Dynasty, they would completely rebuild the Great Wall of China. Remember, it had been built the first time under the Han Dynasty, under the Qin Dynasty, Qin Shi Huangdi, about in the 200s BCE, and it had fallen into a lot of disrepair. And so the Ming Dynasty rebuilt it in the form we see it today, out of brick, etc. So they rebuild the Great Wall of China, but they also rebuild all these roads and canals and things like that to get the economy going again. The Mongols had neglected that sort of infrastructure work. They also planted over 1 billion trees to try to reforest big chunks of China, in part because the population had shrunk. But they also encouraged, China at this time adopted a new strain of rice that was more productive. They got better at growing silk with fish ponds around the mulberry trees, which allowed them to produce a lot more fish. And so food production dramatically increased. And as a result of the increase in trade and as a result of food supply increase and a number of other policies that the Ming Dynasty did, they really caused the population of China to take off again. It was when the Mongol left, it might have been population of China might have been 70 million, but by the mid-1660s it was 150 million, and by the mid-1700s it was 300 million. So it was 4.5 times as big by the 1700s as it was in the mid-1300s. So over 400 years it had more than tripled. Grown almost 7 times. And so the Ming Dynasty was really a sort of a period of rebuilding, but it's instructive that the Ming Dynasty held together, and the Ming Dynasty sort of reasserted itself as a Confucian society. It reconnected to its traditions. The Ming clearly readopted Confucianism and rebuilt the traditional Chinese bureaucracy, etc. And so China sort of comes out of its horrible encounter with the Mongols and the Black Death, etc. It suffers horrifically, but it comes out of it much stronger in a much more by reasserting its traditional identity and its traditional structures. Europe goes through a very similar period with the Black Death in the 1300s, with the Hundred Years' War, with the Great Famine, etc., and then the Reformation and Renaissance. And Europe comes out of it much stronger also, but Europe goes in a dramatically different direction. Europe decides to chart a new course. They go through this horrible period, and that opens the door for them to take an entirely new direction, away from medieval Christianity and towards a more modern individualistic society. China doesn't do that. Right? And I want to ask why. And there's just, I don't have good answers. I don't have a final answer on any of this. But I want to point out just a couple things. One is that for the Chinese, the disruption was clearly external. It was the Mongols who came from outside, and when they got kicked out, then they could fix things. So that tended to make them not rethink the basic foundations of their society, because they had no reason to think the basic foundations didn't work. It was just an external problem with the Mongols. With Europe, there was no external problem like that. The problem was internal to Europe. Now, I mean, the Black Death came from outside, but the Hundred Years' War and the peasant revolts, etc., were internal to Europe, right? And so Europeans couldn't say, well, that was the problem. If we get rid of that, then we're fine again. China could, right? The second is that in China, the government, the Mongols had embraced a sort of Buddhism in China, but for the Han Chinese reasserting themselves under the Ming Dynasty, they could again reunite the government with a coherent religious or social philosophy in Neo-Confucianism, and this meant that the sort of philosophical foundations of society were so closely connected to the government that they were mutually reinforcing. And we've seen this over and over again throughout this course, that official religions of society, Zoroastrianism in Persia, or Hinduism in India, or Confucianism in China, they're really stabilizing. Right? If the government embraces this official religion and really says this is how God wants it, or this is the natural way for things to be, that can really be a stabilizing force. But in Europe, there was a slightly different situation. Europe had Christianity as this stabilizing force, but Europe, after the breakup of Charlemagne's empire, never really had a unified political government again in the Middle Ages. And so you had this strange situation where you had this big institution, the Catholic Church, which was outside of the government, and it was not connected to the government. I mean, it had relationships and connections to the kingdom of France, or the kingdom of Spain, or the kingdom of the Holy Roman Emperor, or England, or what have you, but it didn't really have the same relationship that Confucianism did in China, where it was built right into the government. The governments recognized the church, but the church was in some ways external to the government. And I really think that division allowed for the European culture at the end of the Middle Ages, to break up in ways that it didn't in China. All right, and then of course the last part is related to that, which is that Europe, we talk about Europe, but Europe was a whole bunch of separate kingdoms, right? There were different kingdoms that were competing with each other and often fighting with each other in a way that China didn't have, because China was a unified government controlling all of China, and because of that, the Chinese government was able to maintain stability in a way that European governments couldn't, because they always had these external competitors, France and the Holy Roman Emperor, and France and England, etc. And so they were all in these Italian city-states. So you had a certain level of chaos in Europe because of political divisions, even if you had religious unity. And I think that ultimately we'll see, if you take the next part of the course, that it's those political divisions that ultimately allow the Reformation to happen, which breaks apart the religious unity too. So the political divisions ultimately would break up the religious unity of Europe. And it's the breakup of this sort of consensus on the Catholic Church, it's the breakup of this consensus on feudalism, etc., that allows Europe to go in a totally different direction. And so China reasserts itself on this path of the conservative, we're going back to what we had before, because they saw the Mongols as external, and because they were unified and the government could adopt this official philosophy, it could create a stability there using Confucianism, using a unified government controlling the whole country, that allowed it to maintain or return to this original path. Whereas Europe, after the upheavals of the Black Death, etc., Europe had this political disunity, and we see it in the Hundred Years' War, but it also had, the religion was separate from the political governments, which allowed for the disunity of the political governments to sort of infect and shape the breakup of the religious community also. And so Europe winds up going on a dramatically different course and rejecting medieval Christianity and turning in a new Renaissance vision towards individualism, etc. But China continues to try to reassert this sort of unified cultural stability through Neo-Confucianism and a unified government.